Yeah, what's good, people? I hope you're all doing well. As you can see at the beginning of the video, the weather outside is not the prettiest today, but as you voted last week, here I am with another mixing tutorial. This time is advanced, which means you will learn some new techniques which will improve the mixes of your beats. This video is a continuation of my previous video, how to mix your beats the fast way. Here is the previous video if you haven't watched it. So if you haven't mixed a single beat in your life, just start with this video right here, and make sure you followed me on Instagram. I'm dropping some cool and useful stuff there, as well as some tips for Reaper and mixing and stuff. Okay, so today we're going to learn how to pan your beats properly. If you have lots of instruments, lots of different tracks, and everything sits in the center, it just doesn't sound really good. So I will tell you my techniques and my tips for spreading it across the stereo field. We'll talk about saturation, so I'll tell you how to color up your sound and make it more vibrant, make it just more interesting and more saturated, because that's what saturation does. And we will take a deeper look into reverbs. We'll use multiple reverbs, we will be blending different reverbs for different purposes. So there's going to happen lots of interesting stuff here. If you are here for a particular reason, here are the timestamps. They are also in the description right below, so you can just navigate to the part of the video you would like to hear about. So here is one of my most recent beats. It already has a basic mix. It means I've done the leveling, I've done the EQing, I've cleaned everything I don't need, and I boosted some frequencies, and I've added some delay to some cymbals and stuff. So basically everything I've explained in the previous video about mixing. By the way, if you need a personal one-on-one mixing lesson, you can check the offer on my website. The first lesson is 50% off. Let me just grab some water because I'm going to talk a lot. Okay, so let's start from my basic point of view. Here are the headphones. This is the left headphone, this is the right headphone. When creating music, we only have two channels, left and right. Two speakers, two headphones, and nothing more. And we need to fit all of those instruments playing in those two channels. And if everything was playing same as loud from both headphones, it would be in mono and it would just sound really messy. So that's why we are moving some things to the right, some things to the left, and we are using this stereo field we have, those two channels. Because believe me or not, in the past we didn't have stereo, everything was in mono. People were listening to music on one speaker only, on a radio and stuff. But there is one more axis, because we have left, we have right, and there is the third dimension achieved by different reverbs. And thanks to them, we can make something sound really close to us or from another point. Like, for example, if you were on a huge sports hall and you would be talking to me standing right next to me, I would hear you clearly. But if you were at the other end of this hall, I would just hear your voice with lots of reverb, lots of, space. So let's sum it up. Right, left, close, far, not so close, and really far, for example. We can also be really far on the right or really far on the left. So basically you have a huge space to operate with. Okay, now let's practice. Right now in this beat, everything's in the center. Everything plays equally loud from the left and from the right speaker. Nothing's happening in the stereo field. Let's start from the drums. Here's how the drums sound like. Of course, as you can see and as you could hear, there is this thing right here, which is in stereo by default, because that's the loop from Cymatics. And it's already in stereo, so I didn't turn it into mono. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I've changed all those other cymbals to mono things, so with one channel. Okay, kick drum. Should we pan the kick drum to the right or to the left? No, the kick drum always stays in the center. Never pan the kick drum. In the 99.99% of the times, the kick drum stays in the center. Human ears aren't really good as far as recognizing where the bass is coming from. I mean, human ear doesn't really know if the subwoofer in your car is in the back of your car or next to you. And of course, the same goes to 808s. So all the lower part of your 808, all the lower part of the spectrum, I mean everything below 200, 150 Hertz, depends on the beat of course, should be in mono. The next thing is the snare. The snare should also be in the center of your mix, but you can of course spread some higher frequencies with some stereo shapers or some choruses or different effects for a better stereo field of your snare in the higher spectrum. But the punch, the lower part of the spectrum of the snare, should always be in the center. That's how you are doing things when recording a real drum set. The kick drum and the snare drum are in the center, so they stay in the center, and all the other things can be panned, depending on how far from the center axis of the drum set they are. The hi-hats. Should the hi-hats be in the center? Not really. I think you can basically do everything you want with the hi-hats. You can pan the hi-hat a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. You can just make them move from right to left. You can automate the hi-hats. You can add some effects like flangers, choruses to make them more spacey. As far as it's not like really hard panning when you are panning the hi-hat 100% to the left, because that would just sound really, really bad. And cymbals. Here is where the magic happens. All the cymbals are basically things playing in the higher part of the spectrum, and the stereo field in the higher part of the spectrum is usually much more wide. This means we have some cymbals playing on the right, some other cymbals playing on the left, and we are creating a feeling of a space. Something's on the right, something's on the left, you know, stuff is happening around you. That's why we are basically panning things. Okay, so I'm leaving the kick, clap, and snare in the center, but for the hi-hats, I'm going to drop an effect called ping pong pan. Yeah, ping pong pan. Here is how it goes. Ping pong pan. This is a JS plugin for Reaper, which basically lets you pan your hi-hats automatically with a certain frequency from right to left. Now it's really hard, like 70%, and it sounds like that. So as I told you, we don't want those hi-hats to be that much like spread on the whole beat, so I'm just going to move this with fader to around like 7%, something like that. Not really much, it just has to be an accent. Okay, I've decided to keep it at 10%. It's much better now. If you want to hear this effect properly, you should be wearing headphones now, because you can't really hear the stereo field when listening on your phone, if you are watching this on your phone or a laptop, for example. As you could probably hear, it's not like a super huge effect, like wow, it just changed everything. It's just a little small accent for the hi-hat only. Now, this cymbal right here, which does this, for this cymbal, I will be using the pan automation. In Reaper, just press P on your keyboard and the automation curve will appear. Let's make it bigger. And when you have grid and snap turned on, you can just hold Shift and you will be placing points of automation perfectly with the grid. So basically, what I want to do is I want to pan this 50% to the left and this to the right, this to the left, this to the right, and so on. So I'm holding Shift, I'm making some points, 50%, making some points, 50%. So now this is going to play on the left and this is going to play on the right. So now this is going to be played more on the left and this is going to be played more on the right. So now, as I just don't want to waste all my time on this automation, I'm just selecting this right here on the ruler. I'm pressing the right button of the mouse. I go to automation items and here's a new automation item. And right now I have an automation item which I can just copy. So Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, Ctrl-V, Ctrl-V. And now I've just made a repetition of this automation curve I've just written. So it's just much faster. Okay, now we have this crash right here. This tiny crash with some delay. And let's just make a minor change. Let's pan it a little bit to the left, like 15, 20%. Maybe less, 15%. And that's really it, it's just not in the center anymore. Now we have this hi-hat loop right here. It's already in stereo, so I don't want to change it. You know, there is some additional stuff happening around, so that's just a pre-made loop. Now we have those two things, gong and crash huge. So as they are both pretty long, I'm just going to pan gong to the left, like 20%, and this crash to the right. And now it just feels much more wide. Okay, so that's how the panned drums sound like. Okay, let's move to the melodies we have right here. Here is the first one. Here is the second one. Here is the third one. So as the melody number 1 and number 2 is higher than this one, melody number 3, played on a xylophone or something, I'm just going to pan this to the left and this to the right. So thanks to this lower xylophone stays in the center and those higher bells are just more wide. There is a bell on the right and there is a bell on the left. So that's how it sounds with and without panning. So I definitely prefer the wider version. In this scenario, panning could help to bring up the xylophone, which was covered with those bells as they were playing in the center. Now we also have a counter melody. Let's use some ping pong pan for the counter melody. And let's set it to like 70%, something like that, so the counter melody will be just traveling from right to left. And here is the riser I've made from details of those samples. Let's just basically make some panning, like 30% to the right, 30% to the left, 30% to the right, 30% to the left. And that's really it. As you pan the things in the mix, you may want to change the levels, because when something is stereo, it may seem louder. So in this case, I just want to make the melodies quieter, just a little bit. So we've basically panned everything we need to pan in the beat. Okay, now we will talk about saturation. As I told you at the beginning, saturation is about coloring up the sound. Saturation has different origins and different styles. Basically, saturation is a form of distortion. So we are doing damage to the signal to make it more harsh, to make it just more warm in some cases. Let me explain it to you. And as an example, I will use the 808 right here. My saturation of choice is the Isotope Neutrons Exciter. Really simple to use and really, really powerful. It has 4 different types of saturation: retro, tape, tube, and warm. Every of those types adds different harmonics, different stuff, so it's really interesting, and you can just blend between those saturation styles. And here you can select a piece of spectrum you'd like to saturate, and you can apply different types of saturation to different parts of the spectrum, which is really good because I like to use warm saturation for the low end and, for example, some tube saturation for the high end to make it buzz more. And saturation can bring lots of things to life since it adds harmonics, which will make your sound richer. By default, this 808 sounds like that. The sample I'm using is already a little bit saturated because this 808, it's a little bit aggressive, but it's really dark. Everything's happening in the low end in this 808. So let's bring up some higher frequencies to life and let's make this 808 buzz. So for buzzing, I suggest using tube or tape saturation. You can use any other plugin. I don't mean you have to use Isotope. That's just my plugin of choice. This will also make your kick, 808, anything happening in the low end, easier to hear on a device such as phone. Maybe you've been wondering why some of the beats just sound good on a phone, which doesn't really have a speaker that has a lot of bass. And that's mostly thanks to saturation, which brings up some higher or middle frequencies to life. Okay, the next part of the spectrum we're going to saturate is from 150 Hz to this 1K we've already set up. And in this case, I'm going to be using tape or retro saturation. I don't really know yet. Let's just experiment and find what sounds the best. The retro is just a little bit warmer than tape, and I don't want this 808 to be too aggressive in the middle. And now the last spectrum, which is the bass. I like to use warm saturation on the bass. It doesn't really change a lot in this case. It's really subtle. It just only adds a little bit of warmth to the low end. So let's compare how it sounds like with and without saturation. So the effect is really easy to hear. In my opinion, it's too aggressive, so I'm going to bring this mix down a little bit, like 30% of the original signal and 70% of this aggressive signal. Because I really like this initial sound. It was really bassy, it had a lot of this really warm low end, but I just wanted to turn it into something a little bit more aggressive. In Reaper you also have a saturation module. It's really simple, it just has the amount fader and nothing more, so you can't really select the spectrum you're going to saturate, but it sounds pretty good. Let's have a listen. It just makes the sound a little bit warmer. And don't forget about the wave shaping distortion, which can make your 808 sound like hell. So you can definitely use it for the high end. If you want to see my episode about different saturation plugins in Reaper, here it goes. And now we are going to talk about blending different reverbs. From the previous episode, you already know that you should be using reverb sands instead of putting a new instance of reverb on each track you are using. Long story short, it helps your CPU because you are not using 12 different reverbs. And the second thing is, it makes your mix sound more cohesive because you are not using a ton of different sound spaces. It's good to limit yourself to like 4 to 5 reverbs you really like from a really short reverbs to really huge reverbs. This will also let you create your own sound space of choice. Let's just add one more reverb right here, which will be drum reverb I really like to use. And here is my favorite preset for the drum reverb, modern drums. It's a really short kind of reverb, so it just gives you a feeling of a really small room. Let's start from the snare. I prefer to start putting reverbs from the snare because it's like the most important drum for me. So now, as I will be doing a lot of drag and dropping here in the mixer, I'm just going to turn this mode right here, which is show multiple rows of tracks when size permits. And now I can see all the tracks from my session, and it will be just easy to mix. Okay, here is the snare. Here is the routing, which I'm going to drag and drop on different reverbs. And let's start from the drum reverb. And thanks to this drum reverb, this snare is not as dry as it was. It just has a little bit more space to it. And that's really it. Now let's add some different reverb to the snare. I like to use my vocal reverb, which is just bigger. If you are adding the reverb, you may find your snare too quiet, so you can just adjust it a little bit. Now let's send the hi-hats to the drum reverb. And maybe to the plate reverb. It's a really huge reverb. For the cymbals, I like to use a really long reverb. So here I have a TC tail reverb, which is just a really long reverb. Let's send this cymbal to this reverb, and it sounds like that. Really huge reverb. Another cymbal. Okay, this hi-hat loop. I want this to be like far away. Now the huge crash. And the gong. And that's how the full drum loop sounds like with reverbs. And for the clap, I just like to use the same reverb I've used on the snare, so I'm just going to drag and drop the same reverb settings and make them just a little bit lower. Now let's move to the melodies. Those melodies already have the reverb because those are the melodies I've recorded with my Korg PA1X, which already has a reverb send built in. So I don't want to mess them too much. So I'll be making a group of them and I will send this whole group to the plate reverb. So they will just fit more into the sound space of this particular beat, and the same for the riser. And the last thing we're going to reverb is the counter melody. Of course, it has some reverb because it's also from the Korg PA1X, but in this case, I want this melody to be more in the background because it's not as important as the main melody is. So let's just throw it to the TC tail reverb we've used for the cymbals. And maybe also the plate bright reverb I have right here. And now we can just simply make this counter melody quieter because it will be easier to hear from the background with those bright reverbs. So that were some more advanced tips for mixing your beats. I hope this video will help you to develop more interesting sounds in your beats. I also want to make two separate videos about two really important things. The first one is EQing. So I'm going to make a full video about EQing, not only about just, cutting some frequencies and adding some frequencies, but some particular philosophy and way of thinking in terms of EQing. And the second video about compression of particular instruments, compression of basses, for example, drum bass compression, which will make your drums sound fatter and more under control. But it's just a pretty huge subject for me, and I didn't want to include it in this video because it would be like an hour and a half. So that's everything for today. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button. If you have any questions and concerns, the comment section is yours. My name is Dominic, you've been watching Wodzu Beats, and keep the good vibes alive!